Hey friend, welcome back, or if this is your first time here, welcome. Pull up your blanket, settle into that comfortable spot of yours, and let's spend some time together tonight. Imagine this. It's 1913. You're a 22-year-old woman. You've just stepped off a train in Chicago alone. You have a small leather bag with everything you own, $7 in your coat pocket, and a piece of paper with an address on it. Not a hotel, not a family member's home, just an address, a door. And when you knock on that door, you have absolutely no idea that the world on the other side of it, the smells, the sounds, the strange women who will become your closest friends and your most complicated rivals, is about to shape the entire rest of your life. That is where our story begins tonight. Behind that door, in a place that millions of American women once called home, the boarding house. And hey, before we get into it, if this kind of story is what you love, slow, rich, real history, that feels like it happened to someone you know, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video. You don't have to do it just because I asked. Do it because you genuinely feel like tonight's story is worth it. And if you want to say hello, drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or what time it is, or just how you're feeling. I read every single one. All right, dim those lights just a little. Let the room get quiet, and let's go back. To understand why the boarding house mattered so deeply to women in the 1910s, you first have to understand how completely the world was tilted against them. Think about this for a moment. In 1910, there were over 7.5 million women working for wages in the United States. 7.5 million. That number had doubled in just 30 years, driven by factories opening their doors, by department stores needing sales clerks, by offices needing typewriter operators, by telephone exchanges needing operators. The economy was hungry for women's labor. It just did not want to deal with where those women slept at night. Because here's the thing, most of these working women were not married. They were young, they were single. Many had come from somewhere else entirely, and they had nowhere to go. Hotels were for travelers, not for long-term single women, and honestly, a woman living alone in a hotel in 1913 was practically asking to have her reputation ruined before she had even unpacked. Apartment buildings existed, but landlords were extraordinarily reluctant to rent to single women without a male co-signer, which, if you think about it, is a spectacular catch-22. You need a man to vouch for you to get an apartment, but you came to the city precisely because you did not have a man to depend on. So what did you do? You knocked on the door of a boarding house. The years between 1910 and 1919 were years of enormous upheaval and movement in America. People were on the move in every direction you could imagine. Young women from rural farms in Ohio and Kentucky were coming to cities like Columbus and Louisville, chasing wages in garment factories and laundries. Immigrant women from Poland, Italy, and Eastern Europe were pouring through Ellis Island and spreading through the industrial cities of the Northeast, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Buffalo. African American women were beginning what historians would later call the Great Migration northward, leaving the South in the face of Jim Crow laws and sharecropping poverty, heading toward Detroit, Philadelphia, and New York, where the promises were bigger, even if the welcome was not always warm. And all of these women from wildly different backgrounds, different languages, different skin colors, different religions, all of them faced the same basic problem. They needed a place to sleep that was safe, affordable, and would not destroy their social standing before they had even found their footing. The boarding house was in many ways the only logical answer that existed. Now I want to take a moment here because when most people today hear the words boarding house, they imagine something either terribly romantic, like something out of a Jane Austen novel with a fireplace and a landlady serving tea, or something terribly grim like a Dickens nightmare with rats and no heating. The truth, as it usually is, was somewhere much more interesting and complicated than either of those pictures. A boarding house in the 1910s was essentially a private home, usually a large row house or a converted Victorian mansion, where the owner almost always a woman rented out individual rooms to a rotating cast of residents. In exchange for a weekly fee, you got your room, usually your breakfast and dinner, and access to shared facilities. A bathroom down the hall, a parlour where you could sit in the evening, maybe a dining room where everyone ate together at a long table. According to a 1914 survey conducted by the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average weekly rate for room and board in a major American city ran somewhere between $3.50 and $5. That sounds almost laughably cheap by today's standards, but when you consider that the average female factory worker in 1914 earned somewhere around $6 to $8 per week, you begin to see immediately how tight things really were. Half your wages gone before you bought a single thing. And that is the economic reality that defined life in the boarding house from the very first moment a woman walked through that door. She was not there because she wanted to be. She was there because the math left her no other option. The range of women who ended up in boarding houses during the 1910s is genuinely astonishing when you start to dig into the historical record. You had young women like Agnes Nestor, a real woman, a real story, who arrived in Chicago in the early 1900s from a small Michigan town, found work in a glove factory, and rented a room in a boarding house on the near West Side, while she began organizing her fellow workers into what would eventually become one of the first successful women's labor unions in American history. Agnes ate her meals at a long table with 10 other women every single night. She learned more about the world from those dinner conversations, she later said, than from any book she'd ever read. You had immigrant women like the ones settlement houseworker Grace Abbott documented in her 1912 study of Chicago's immigrant communities. Polish and Bohemian women sharing cramped rooms, pooling resources, navigating a city that spoke a language they were still learning in houses run by landladies who sometimes spoke their language and sometimes absolutely did not. You had young women from the American South, both white and African American, though almost never in the same house, because the brutal reality of racial segregation extended fully into the boarding house world. African American women in northern cities often had access to only a narrow slice of the boarding house market, frequently relying on houses run by other African American women, which became their own remarkable communities of mutual support and quiet resistance. And then here's a group that surprises most people. You had women who were not young at all. Widows, divorced women, women who had lost their financial footing through no fault of their own and found themselves at 40 or 50 years old knocking on a door they never imagined they would need. Here is something that gets lost when we talk about this era from a distance. Most of these women were deeply, quietly ashamed of where they lived, not because the boarding house itself was shameful necessarily, but because in the cultural imagination of the 1910s, a respectable woman was a woman in a home of her own, either with her parents or with a husband. A woman in a boarding house was a woman in a state of incompleteness. She was between things. She was not yet where she was supposed to be. Women's magazines of the era, publications like the Ladies' Home Journal, which reached over 1 million readers by 1910, barely acknowledged the existence of working women in boarding houses at all. They were invisible in the culture that was supposedly speaking to women. The recipes were for women with full kitchens. The advice columns were for wives managing households. The fiction was about drawing rooms and proposals and weddings. Meanwhile, 7.5 million women were coming home at the end of a 10-hour shift, climbing the stairs of a boarding house, eating whatever the landlady had put on the table, and falling asleep in a bed that was sometimes not even entirely their own. They were an invisible army, and tonight we're going to spend some time actually seeing them, because here is what I find so extraordinary about this history, and I mean genuinely extraordinary. the kind of thing that makes you put down whatever you are holding and just think for a moment. The boarding house, for all its limitations and frustrations and indignities, was also quietly one of the most radical social experiments in American history. It was a space where women, hundreds of thousands of them across decades, figured out how to live independently, how to manage money, how to form communities, how to navigate professional and social worlds that had never been designed with them in mind. The women who passed through those doors went on to lead labour strikes, to march for the right to vote, to open businesses, to write books, to raise children alone, to change the world in ways large and small, and almost none of them got credit for the fact that a big part of how they learned to do all of that was in the dining room of a boarding house at a table full of women who were all figuring it out together. That is the story we're going to tell. Part by part, room by room, night by night, now. You might be thinking, okay, this is all fascinating, but who actually ran these places? Who was the woman on the other side of that door? Because it was not just a house, it was a kingdom. And the woman who owned it, the landlady, had more power over the daily lives of her boarders than almost anyone else in their world. She decided when you ate what you ate, whether you could have visitors, whether you could keep your job, and in some cases whether you would have a roof over your head tomorrow morning. She was part mother, part warden, part businesswoman, and part judge, all wrapped up in one woman who probably smelled faintly of cooking grease and absolutely did not take any nonsense from anyone. So let's meet her. There's a particular kind of woman who shows up in history and never quite gets her due. She isn't a queen. She isn't a suffragette with a sash and a banner. She didn't write a manifesto or lead a march down Fifth Avenue, but she ran something. She ran it with absolute authority, with sharp instincts honed by years of necessity, and with a set of unspoken rules that every woman who ever crossed her threshold understood immediately without being told once. She was the boarding house landlady. And if the boarding house was a small kingdom, she was its undisputed ruler. Let's talk about who she actually was, because the picture is far more interesting than you might expect. The first thing you need to understand is that most boarding house landladies in the 1910s did not choose this life the way you might choose a career today. For the overwhelming majority of them, running a boarding house was not a dream. It was a lifeline. Census records from 1910 and 1915 consistently show that a striking proportion of boarding house operators were widows women who had lost their husbands to industrial accidents, to illness, to the sheer brutality of early 20th century working class life, and who suddenly found themselves with a large house, a small income, and a very urgent question now: what a woman named Mary Ellen Doyle, a widow documented in Hull House settlement records from 1911, put it plainly in an interview with a social worker that year. She said, and I'm reconstructing the spirit of her words here, that when her husband died she had three choices. She could go to her brother's house and be a burden on his family. She could take in laundry at home and slowly ruin her back for wages that wouldn't cover the coal bill. Or she could open her doors and charge for the room she already had. She chose the doors. Within 18 months she was housing 8 women and had a waiting list. And here is what strikes me every time I read accounts like hers. Mary Ellen Doyle went from being economically dependent and suddenly unmoored to being in her own domestic sphere one of the most powerful women on her block. She set the prices. She made the rules. She chose who stayed and who went. In a world that gave women almost no formal institutional power whatsoever, the boarding house was a space where a woman could build genuine authority, not borrowed from a husband, not granted by a father, but earned and exercised on her own terms. That is not a small thing. Now, I want to be honest with you here, because good history requires honesty. Not every landlady was a wise and benevolent matriarch. Some of them were petty tyrants. Some were genuinely kind. Many were some complicated mixture of both, depending on the day and on whether the coal delivery has been late again. The sociologist Annie Marion McLean, one of the earliest American women to earn a doctorate in sociology, which she did from the University of Chicago in 1900, spent years documenting the working lives of women in city across the country. In her 1910 study on women wage earners, she observed boarding house landladies with this particular clarity. She noted that the landlady occupied a uniquely paradoxical position. She was simultaneously a working woman struggling to survive and a figure of genuine domestic authority over other working women who were also struggling to survive. The relationship was rarely simple. It was layered with class anxiety, with mutual dependence, and with a kind of unspoken negotiation that happened every single day. Think about what it actually looked like in practice. Picture a Tuesday morning in a boarding house in Cleveland, Ohio around 1913. The landlady, let's call her by a name common to that era, Mrs. Harriet Kowalski, a Polish-American widow in her late 40s, is downstairs before 6 in the morning. She has oatmeal on the stove and bread that she baked the night before. She knows that 5 of her 8 boarders work at the garment factory 3 blocks over and need to leave by 7. She knows that the young woman in the back room on the 2nd floor, who she thinks might be a telephone operator, has been coming home past 11 2 nights in a row. She noticed. She always notices. By the time her boarders come downstairs, Mrs. Kowalski has already made approximately 40 decisions that will shape their day. What they eat, how warm the house is, whether the front door will be unlocked when they return that evening. These were not trivial matters. In the dead of a Cleveland winter, the temperature of the house was not a comfort issue. It was a survival issue. And who controlled the coal? The landlady. Does this sound extreme a little? But here's the thing, and I've thought about this quite a bit, the landladies also knew something that their boarders sometimes forgot. Running a boarding house was not passive income. It was relentless, physical, invisible labour. It was cooking for 12 people on a budget of less than $1 a day per person. It was scrubbing floors and washing linens and negotiating with coal merchants and dealing with boarders who were 3 days late on rent and crying about it at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night. The landlady was doing the work. She had earned the authority that came with it. And the rules, oh the rules! This is where things get genuinely fascinating. Every boarding house in America in this era had rules, and they were almost never written down anywhere. They lived in the posture and the tone of the landlady herself. A survey of boarding houses conducted by the Young Women's Christian Association between 1912 and 1914, one of the most rigorous social surveys of working women's housing in this period, documented some of the common expectations that landladies enforced across houses in New York, Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia. Boarders were expected to be home by 10 o'clock in the evening and sometimes by 9 on weeknights. Male visitors were permitted in the parlour only and only during specific hours, usually between 6 and 8 in the evening, and only with the parlour door left open. No cooking in the rooms, no hanging laundry from the windows, no loud voices after 9. And in many houses, no talking about wages, no talking about unions, and absolutely no bringing home anything that smelled like alcohol. That last one might make you smile a little. This was, remember, the era right before Prohibition 1920, and many landladies were fiercely temperance-minded, either from genuine moral conviction or from entirely practical experience with what happened when working women had access to gin on a weeknight. Now pause for just a moment and ask yourself, if you had to live under those rules, how long would you last? I'll admit personally the 10 o'clock curfew alone would have broken me within the first week. But here is the thing that took me a while to fully appreciate for many of the women living in these houses, especially those who'd arrived from small towns or from overseas. Those rules were not just constraints, they were also a form of protection. in a city that could be genuinely dangerous for a young woman alone, where the options outside the boarding house included rooming houses with no rules at all, which were often far less safe. The landlady's watchful eye was not always unwelcome. Several women interviewed in the Young Women's Christian Association surveys specifically said they chose stricter houses deliberately. They felt safer under a landlady who noticed things, who kept a list of who came and went. That is a nuance that gets lost when we look at these rules from a modern distance and see only the control. The control was real. But so was the protection it sometimes provided. One more woman I want to bring into this conversation, because her story captures something I find genuinely moving. Her name was Bridget Murphy, not a famous Bridget Murphy, just a real one documented in a 1916 social welfare case file from the city of Boston. Bridget had come from County Clare in Ireland in 1908, worked as a domestic servant for 4 years, saved every penny she could, and in 1912 scraped together enough money to lease a house in the Roxbury neighbourhood of Boston. She opened it as a boarding house for Irish immigrant women, specifically for women who had just arrived and didn't know anyone didn't speak much English beyond what they'd picked up on the boat, and desperately needed someone who understood them. What Bridget built was not just a business, it was a bridge. A one-woman immigration support system operating out of a row house kitchen. She taught her boarders how to navigate the streetcar system, how to find factory jobs, how to send money orders back to Ireland, how to talk to a landlord, all the knowledge that the city expected you to already have and offered no real system for teaching. By 1916, Bridget Murphy had housed over 60 women since she'd opened her doors. 60. Most of them stayed between 6 months and 2 years. Many of them moved into better situations, better jobs, bigger apartments, occasionally marriages. Most of them, by the account of the social worker who documented her case, stayed in touch with Bridget long after they left. She charged a fair rate, enforced a curfew, and ran her household with efficiency and warmth. She was also completely without legal rights to her business. Her name was never in the newspaper, and when that social welfare case file was written, the social worker who wrote it classified her occupation simply as householder. Householder, for a woman who had built a community institution from scratch. I think about Bridget Murphy more than I probably should. And here's what I keep coming back to: the landladies of the 1910s, the Mrs. Kowalskis and the Bridget Murphys and the Mary Ellen Doyles were doing something quietly radical, in an era that did not have a word for it. They were creating infrastructure. They were building the scaffolding that held up the lives of hundreds of thousands of working women, women who would go on to do remarkable things, in part because at the end of an exhausting day they had a door they could come home to. It wasn't glamorous. It rarely gets mentioned in the history books. But it was real, and it mattered enormously. Which brings us to something that mattered in a very different and very immediate way: money. Specifically, what $3.50 a week actually bought you, and what it didn't. Because once you understand the economics of life inside these walls, the whole picture of what these women endured and somehow managed comes into focus in a way that's almost breathtaking. Let's go there next. Let me give you a number, and I want you to sit with it for a moment. $3.50. That is what a week of your life cost in a boarding house in 1913. Your room, your breakfast, your dinner, your roof on a January night when the temperature in Chicago dropped below zero and the wind came off Lake Michigan, like something with a personal grudge against you specifically. $3.50. Now, before you nod and think, well, that was a different time, money was worth more, yes, you're right, it was. Adjusted for inflation, that weekly rate sits somewhere between $85 and $95 in today's money, which still sounds manageable until you do the other half of the math. Because the average female factory worker in 1913 earned, according to the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics report, published that same year somewhere between $6 and $8 per week. A department store sales clerk made slightly less often, between $5 and $7. A telephone operator, one of the more coveted positions available to women at the time, might clear $7 or $8 in a good week. So take the lowest realistic wage, $6. Subtract $3.50 for room and board. You have $2.50 left, $2.50, for everything else, for the week. I want you to think about what everything else actually meant. It meant the streetcar fare to get to work and back about 10 cents a day in most cities, which adds up to 60 cents across a 6-day work week. So now you have $1.90. It meant the work clothes you were expected to show up in clean and pressed, because showing up wrinkled or dirty was grounds for dismissal at most establishments, and keeping clothes clean meant either paying for laundry, roughly 25 to 30 cents a week at a commercial laundry, or spending your precious Sunday afternoon washing them yourself in cold water and hoping they dried before Monday. It meant the shoes that wore through at the sole because you were standing on a factory floor for 10 hours at a stretch, and a basic pair of women's work shoes ran between $1 and $2. It meant, if you were lucky, a small purchase of something that wasn't strictly necessary, a nickel for a newspaper, a few cents for a piece of candy, a 10-cent ticket to the Nickelodeon on a Saturday evening, because you were 23 years old and you needed occasionally to feel like a human being rather than a machine. And here is the thing that took researchers and social reformers of the era by real surprise when they started doing the detailed arithmetic for a significant number of women. The math simply did not add up. It didn't balance. It couldn't. The investigator Mary Van Cleek, a woman whose work at the Russell Sage Foundation in New York between 1910 and 1917 produced some of the most meticulously documented studies of working women's economic lives ever compiled, found in her 1914 investigation of women wage earners in New York City that a substantial portion of the women she interviewed were spending more than they earned. Not because they were irresponsible, not because they were frivolous, but because the wages being paid to women in this era were calibrated consciously and deliberately on the assumption that a woman was a supplementary earner, that she had a father or a husband contributing to the household, and that she therefore did not need a full living wage on her own. The problem, as Van Cleek's data made devastatingly clear, was that an enormous number of these women had no such support. They were entirely self-supporting, and the economy had not been designed with them in mind. So how did they manage? This is the question I find myself turning over every time I read this history, because clearly they did manage somehow imperfectly day after day, year after year. The boarding house itself was part of the answer because it bundled the two largest expenses, shelter and food, into a single predictable payment, which made budgeting slightly less impossible than if you were trying to find separate accommodation and feed yourself independently. But beyond that, women developed a whole ecosystem of informal financial strategies that rarely made it into formal economic records and have consequently been somewhat invisible to history. They lent each other money. Not large amounts a quarter here, 50 cents there, but consistently, and without the formal paperwork that would have made these transactions visible to anyone tracking the economy. A woman at the garment factory who had a good week might quietly cover her table mate's rent shortfall, and that debt would be repaid in kind over the following weeks, or in labour helping with mending, covering an extra shift, sharing food purchased more cheaply in bulk. They pooled resources on food. While the boarding house provided breakfast and dinner, lunch was generally not included, and buying your midday meal near a factory or shop district was expensive relative to income. Many women solved this by collectively purchasing bread, cheese, and whatever fruit was cheap that week from a market near the house, dividing costs to the penny and bringing their own lunch in a tin pail. This practice was common enough that social investigators of the period noted it repeatedly, and also noted with some concern that the nutritional content of these self-assembled lunches was often alarmingly thin. They also, and this is something the historical record tends to gloss over because it made reformers uncomfortable, occasionally engaged in relationships or social arrangements that provided economic cushion without the formal structure of marriage, a male acquaintance who paid for a meal, a theatre ticket, a pair of new gloves. Not all of these arrangements were predatory or exploitative. Many were genuinely mutual, navigated with clear-eyed awareness by women who understood exactly what the transaction involved and chose it deliberately, but it was a line that respectable boarding house life officially insisted did not exist, even as everyone privately knew that it did, and that economic desperation drew women toward it more reliably than any moral failing ever could. Now here is what I think is the most quietly devastating detail in this entire economic picture, and it is one I keep coming back to. In 1914, a subcommittee of the United States Congress held hearings on the conditions of working women in American cities. Witness after witness testified about wages, hours, and living conditions. One witness, a young woman from a Philadelphia textile mill whose name was recorded only as Miss H. In the congressional transcript, her identity protected by reformers who feared retaliation from her employer, described her weekly budget in detail so precise it reads almost like a piece of poetry in its bleakness. She earned $6.25 a week. Her board cost $3.75. That left $2.50. She spent 60 cents on car fare, 20 cents on laundry soap, 15 cents on thread and needles to repair her own clothes, and set aside 25 cents toward a new pair of shoes she'd been saving for 3 months. That left her, she told the committee, with $1.30 for the week, for anything she might need, for any emergency, for any moment of ordinary human pleasure. When one of the congressmen asked her whether she ever went hungry, she paused for what the transcript records as a notable silence before answering. She said not exactly hungry, but sometimes toward the end of the week she was very careful. Very careful. I have thought about that phrase more times than I can count. The remarkable precision of it, the extraordinary dignity of a woman who would not say the word hungry to a room full of men who had the power to change her circumstances and largely chose not to. And yet, and I think this matters as enormously, Miss H was still there. She had made it to that hearing room. She was earning budgeting, surviving, and being articulate in front of a congressional subcommittee about the conditions of her life. There is something in that I find genuinely extraordinary. The boarding house, for all the economic tightness it represented, also represented stability. It meant she knew where she was sleeping on Friday. It meant dinner was accounted for, and in the arithmetic of a life with almost no margin for error, that predictability was not a small thing. It was for many women the difference between surviving and not. Which raises a question I want to sit with for just a moment longer before we move on, because we've talked about the economics of space and food, the official exchange of money for room and meals. But we haven't yet talked about what the actual space looked like, what it felt like to walk up those stairs at the end of a long day, open the door to your room and find what exactly. Because the answer to that question tells you something profound about what privacy meant for women in this era, or more precisely what it didn't mean. And the answer, I promise you, is stranger and more intimate and more complicated than almost anything we've discussed so far. Let's step inside. Close your eyes for a second and imagine this. You finish a 10-hour shift at a garment factory. Your feet ache. Your fingers are stiff from the repetitive motion of the sewing machine. You climb 3 flights of stairs in a boarding house that smells faintly of boiled cabbage and coal smoke. You open the door to your room. You take off your shoes. You pull back the quilt. and then the body of a complete stranger shifts in the bed beside you. Not because anything scandalous has happened, not because you made a choice, but because in the world of the 1910 boarding house the bed was not always yours alone. In fact, for hundreds of thousands of working women across American cities during this decade, sharing a bed with someone you barely knew was simply Tuesday. It was Wednesday. It was every night of the week. This is the part of boarding house history that most accounts skip over quietly, politely, the way people skip over anything that makes the past feel uncomfortably intimate. But if we are going to truly understand what life was like for these women, we cannot look away from the bedroom door, because what happened behind it tells us something profound, not just about poverty or housing policy, but about the strange, complicated, deeply human business of sharing space with another person when you have no other option. Let's go in. The practice had a name that sounds almost whimsical until you actually think about it: hotbedding. The idea was straightforward and ruthlessly efficient. A landlady with, say, 4 beds in 2 rooms could rent each bed to 2 women on alternating schedules, 1 woman who worked a day shift and 1 who worked a night shift. When the day shift worker came home and climbed into bed at 9 in the evening, she was sliding into a space that had been warm from another body just hours earlier. When she left at 6 in the morning, her sleeping partner, the night shift worker, would return and take her place. The bed was never empty. It was never entirely cold, and the landlady, by this elegant and slightly unsettling arrangement, could extract double the rent from a single piece of furniture. Social reformer Mary Simkovich, who ran Greenwich House, one of New York City's most important settlement houses in the Greenwich Village neighborhood, documented this practice extensively in her surveys of working women's housing between 1908 and 1915. She wrote about women who had lived for months in a shared bed before they ever exchanged more than a few words with the person they slept beside. Ships passing in the night, she called them, except it was not the night. It was literally the same bed in rotating shifts without any sentimentality attached to it whatsoever. What strikes me as genuinely fascinating, and I mean that sincerely, is how normalized this was. Not comfortable, not preferred, but normalized. Women who wrote letters home during this period, letters preserved in various historical archives and settlement house collections, almost never mentioned the shared bed as a scandal. They mentioned it the way you might mention a leaky faucet or a long commute, an inconvenience, a feature of the landscape. You adapted. But let us be precise about the scale here, because the numbers deserve to be said out loud. A landmark survey of working women's housing conducted by the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics in 1911, covering over 10,000 women in 7 major cities, including New York, Chicago, and Boston, found that approximately 38% of women living in boarding houses or lodging houses shared their sleeping space with at least one other person. In the lowest cost housing, that percentage climbed considerably higher. Some houses documented in the survey had 3 women to a room sleeping in 2 narrow beds pushed against opposite walls, with a shared dresser between them and a single window that faced a brick wall. 3 women, 2 beds, 1 dresser, 1 window facing a brick wall. Pause on that image for a moment, not because it is shocking though it is, but because those 3 women still got up every morning, put on their clothes, went to work, sent money to their families, and somehow across the course of a decade helped transform American cities in ways that historians are still unpacking 100 years later. The intimacy of the shared bed created social dynamics that were entirely unlike anything that existed in public life. Think about it this way. In 1913, a woman in a city like Philadelphia had almost no truly private space. Her workplace was public. The boarding house parlor was semi-public. The dining room table was a social performance. Even the bathroom was shared. The bedroom, shared as it was the closest thing to genuine privacy that most of these women had, and the person you shared it with became almost by default one of the most important relationships in your daily existence. Historian Joanne Meyerowitz, in her essential 1988 study of women adrift in Chicago, women living independently outside of family households, drew on a remarkable body of primary sources, including diaries, letters, and social welfare case files, to document how these bedroom relationships actually functioned in practice. What she found was a spectrum that was genuinely wide. On one end, profound, lasting friendship. Women who met in a shared bed went on to share apartments, share businesses, share decades of their lives. The enforced intimacy of that sleeping arrangement, knowing the sound of someone's breathing before you knew their last name, knowing their nightmares before you knew their dreams, created a kind of accelerated bond that more conventional social settings simply could not produce. On the other end, quiet, grinding resentment, a woman who snored, a woman who read by candlelight until 2 a.m. when you had to be at the factory by 6, a woman who wept softly every Sunday night which you pretended not to hear, but you did hear every single Sunday, and after a while the sound of her grief became woven into the fabric of your own emotional life, whether you wanted it to be or not. And then there was everything in between, the woman who taught you English, the woman who stole your ribbon, the woman who held your hand the night you got a letter saying your mother was sick back in Ohio, or in Poland, or in County Kerry, and you could not afford the train fare to go home. Has anyone in your life ever known you that well, that accidentally, that unavoidably, there is something worth sitting with in that question? Now, I want to address something directly because it is the kind of thing that gets either sensationalized or sanitized in historical accounts, and I prefer to do neither. Some of the relationships that formed in shared beds were romantic. Not most of them, but some. In an era when the words and frameworks we now have for understanding love between women simply did not exist. In mainstream culture, the boarding house bedroom was one of the few spaces where such closeness could exist without a name, and therefore without immediate social consequence. Historian Lillian Faderman, in her landmark research on romantic friendships between women in 19th and early 20th century America, documented case after case of women who lived together, slept together, shared finances and built full lives together, understood by their communities simply as devoted companions or particular friends. The boarding house was an incubator for some of these relationships. The proximity was constant. The loneliness of city life was real. And the warmth of another person's presence in a narrow bed in a cold room in a city that could feel enormous and indifferent was not a small thing. I am not projecting modern frameworks onto the past. I am saying something simpler than that human beings are human beings in every decade, in every kind of room. There was another dimension to the shared room that rarely gets discussed: the economics of trust. If you shared a room with 1 or 2 other women, you shared space with their possessions. Their savings were often kept in a small envelope tucked under the mattress, or into the lining of a coat, because there were no individual lockboxes, no private safes, no secure place to store the money you had worked 10 hours a day to earn. You had the mattress and the coat lining, and you had the implicit, fragile, absolutely essential trust of the women who shared your room. The settlement house records of Chicago's Hull House from the years 1910 through 1916 contain multiple documented cases of theft between boarding house roommates, money taken a week's wages gone. Each case is described with a particular exhaustion, the exhaustion of people who know that the loss is both financial and something deeper. Because when someone you sleep beside steals from you, it is not just money. It is the betrayal of the one relationship in your day you'd allowed yourself to relax into. But here is the other side of that same ledger. Those same records contain equally numerous accounts of women who lent money to their roommates during hard weeks, who kept each other's secrets, who covered for each other with the landlady, who nursed each other through illness, the influenza that swept through cities in this decade with terrifying speed at genuine personal risk, because leaving a sick woman alone in a bed you both shared was simply not something you did. By the late 1910s, reformers and housing advocates were becoming increasingly vocal about shared sleeping conditions. The National Consumers League, which had been pushing for labour reforms throughout the decade, began adding housing standards to its advocacy work around 1916 and 1917. Organisations affiliated with the Young Women's Christian Association lobbied municipal governments for minimum space requirements. In lodging houses, a minimum of 400 cubic feet of airspace per occupant. That sounds clinical until you realise that many of the rooms being documented at the time fell dramatically short of even that modest threshold. The reform conversation was real, and it mattered. But it moved slowly. The women sleeping in those narrow beds in 1913 were not waiting for policy. They were adapting, surviving, and in ways large and small building lives inside the constraints they had been handed. What I keep returning to every time I sit with this history is this: the shared bed was an indignity. Absolutely. It reflected how little the broader world valued the comfort and privacy of working women. But inside that indignity, something unexpected happened. These women learned through pure unavoidable necessity how to live in genuine closeness with people who were not their family, how to tolerate difference, how to extend grace to a stranger, how to be known and to know someone else in the unsentimental, unglamorous way that comes from sharing space when you have no other choice. That is a quietly extraordinary skill, and the world in almost every era has asked working people to develop it, without ever acknowledging it requires any skill at all. Speaking of what got acknowledged and what did not, there was one place in the boarding house where everything that happened in private suddenly became public, where your clothes, your accent, your table manners, and your quiet ambitions were all on display at exactly the same time, where the real social architecture of the house revealed itself meal by meal, chair by chair. The dining table, and what happened there, the rivalries, the alliances, the performances, the moments of unexpected grace, was far more complicated and far more revealing than anything you might expect from a simple shared dinner. Let's pull up a chair and see. Picture a long wooden table, maybe 12 feet end to end, 8 chairs on each side, 2 at each head, a cast iron pot of something soup, stew, whatever was cheapest at the market that morning, sitting in the centre still steaming, a plate of bread, a pitcher of water, and somewhere between 12 and 16 women who've been on their feet since before sunrise sitting down together for the first time all day. This happened twice a day every day in boarding houses across America in the 1910s. Breakfast before work, dinner when work was done. It was by nearly every account left behind by the women who lived through it, one of the most socially dense experiences of their entire lives. And I mean that in the fullest possible sense. Dense with information, dense with judgment, dense with the particular kind of performance that happens when you are tired and hungry, and still very much aware that the 11 other women at this table are forming opinions about you with every bite you take. Because here is what we tend to forget when we romanticize communal living: a shared table is not just a shared meal, it is a stage. And whether you wanted to perform or not, you were performing every single evening in a room where the audience knew exactly where you worked, roughly what you earned, what you wore to come home in, and how you held your fork. Let me take you to a specific table, not a fictional one, a documented one. In 1915, a researcher named Louise Montgomery published a study through the University of Chicago Press titled "The American Girl in the Stockyards District," Montgomery had spent 3 years living in and around the working-class neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side, interviewing women attending their dinners sitting in their parlors. Her observations of the boarding house dining table are, in my estimation, some of the most vivid primary source material we have about this specific world. She wrote about a boarding house on South Halsted Street that housed 14 women mostly employed in the meatpacking industry and the nearby garment trade. The dining table, she noted, had developed an unspoken but thoroughly understood seating hierarchy within weeks of each woman's arrival. The women who'd been there longest sat closest to the landlady's end of the table. The newest arrivals sat at the far end near the kitchen door where the bread was served last, and the soup had sometimes been sitting in the pot long enough to lose whatever faint warmth it had started with. Nobody assigned these seats. Nobody announced them. They simply existed as durable and as certain as any formal arrangement, enforced entirely by social pressure and the collective memory of 14 women who had watched every new arrival navigate the same unspoken geography. Does that remind you of any table you have ever sat at? I suspect it might. What got talked about at these tables is its own fascinating subject, because the boarding house dinner was essentially a daily news broadcast, local, personal, and relentlessly detailed. Women reported on their work days. They shared gossip about supervisors and shop floors. They discussed which establishments had cut hours, which factories were rumoured to be hiring, which streetcar lines were running late. They passed along practical intelligence which doctor in the neighbourhood would see a patient for 50 cents rather than $1, which laundry on the next block did better work for the same price, which corner shop gave a little extra to regular customers on a Friday. This information exchange was not incidental. It was one of the primary mechanisms through which working women in this era navigated cities that had essentially no formal infrastructure for helping them. There was no internet. There were no review sites. There were no immigrant services organizations, no women's career centers, no formal job boards for the kinds of positions most boarding house women held. What there was the dinner table, and what got passed along at that table was the accumulated practical wisdom of a dozen women who had been learning the city one hard lesson at a time. Urban historian Sarah Deutsch, in her research on women and the city during the Progressive era, made a point that has stayed with me since I first read it. She observed that the boarding house table functioned as an informal labour exchange, a place where job leads circulated, where warnings about bad employers spread, and where the economic knowledge that women's wages could barely buy was freely redistributed among women who had pooled the cost of their living arrangements. Information, in other words, as a kind of shared resource, the table as a living, breathing database. Now here is where the social complexity really begins to reveal itself. The women at any given boarding house table were almost never socially homogeneous. They came from different places, different backgrounds, different rungs on the class ladder that the broader world had assigned them to, and the table, because it forced proximity without erasing difference, became the site where those distinctions got negotiated, tested, and occasionally dissolved. Consider the tension between immigrant women and native-born American women that Louise Montgomery documented in her South Halsted Street study. At the table, language was the most immediate dividing line. Women who spoke limited English often found themselves grouped together by necessity at one end, conducting quiet side conversations in Polish or Bohemian, while the main table discussion flowed in English around them. This was not malicious. It was the entirely human reflex of gravitating toward the people you can actually talk to at the end of a long, exhausting day. But it meant that the table, which could have been a bridge, sometimes reinforced the very divisions it might have helped dissolve. And yet, Montgomery also documented moments that cut directly against that pattern. She described one particular evening on South Halsted Street. and I find this detail genuinely moving when a Polish woman named Marta, who'd been at the house for about 6 months and spoke halting English, received word that afternoon that her sister had died back in Krakow. She came to the dinner table and said nothing. She sat down and could not eat, and the woman beside her, an American-born woman from rural Tennessee named Ruth, with whom Marta had exchanged barely 20 words in 6 months of shared meals, simply reached over and put her hand over Marta's hand. They sat like that for a while. No language, no common background, no shared religion, no shared history, no shared anything except this table and the fact of being far from home. I have read a lot of boarding house accounts, and that moment stops me every time, because it captures something that the formal history of this era tends to miss entirely: the quiet, unremarkable grace that got distributed at these tables alongside the soup. The table was also, it must be said, a place where the social anxieties of the era played out with sometimes uncomfortable clarity. Class performance at the dinner table was serious business. The way a woman spoke, the vocabulary she used, the table manners she displayed, these were read constantly and carefully as signals about her origins and her aspirations. A woman who had grown up in a middle-class household and fallen on hard times would signal her background through the way she held a knife. A woman from a rural farm family newly arrived in the city might find herself watched with a particular attentive scrutiny by women who had been city dwellers long enough to have developed opinions about what counted as refinement. The etiquette advisor Marion Harland, whose columns and books on domestic behaviour reached enormous audiences in the early 1900s, actually addressed the boarding house table in a 1912 piece in a popular women's magazine. She wrote with the breezy confidence that characterizes all etiquette writing that a well-bred woman should be identifiable at any table by her composure, her measured speech, and her restraint in eating. Which is a perfectly lovely sentiment unless you consider that the women at most boarding house tables had been standing in a factory for 10 hours and were genuinely, legitimately hungry, and restraint in eating from a position of abundance is a very different thing from restraint when the bread plate is running low and you're not sure the landlady has kept dinner warm. Here is my honest personal opinion on this. For whatever it is worth, the cultural obsession with respectability at the boarding house table, the constant vigilance about manners, about speech, about appearance, was in some ways the internalization of a standard that had been set by people who never had to worry about whether there was enough bread. The women performing refinement at these tables were doing something genuinely difficult. They were maintaining the dignity that their circumstances kept trying to strip from them, and they were doing it at 6 in the evening after a 10-hour shift in front of an audience of women who understood every inch of the performance, because they were all performing the same thing. That deserves more than a footnote, that deserves recognition. There was another function of the boarding house table that I want to spend a moment on because it is one that social historians have only relatively recently begun to document with the seriousness it merits. The table was where politics entered working women's lives, not through formal channels, not through newspapers or speeches or pamphlets, though all of those things existed and mattered, but through conversation, through the slow accumulating weight of shared grievance articulated aloud in a room where everyone at the table had the same grievance. In the years between 1910 and 1919, 3 major currents of political change were moving through American women's lives: the labor movement, the suffrage movement, and the progressive reform movement. All 3 of them found their way to boarding house dinner tables, not as abstract political ideas, but as immediate practical concerns rooted in the daily reality of women who were working too long for too little, living in conditions that reformers were increasingly documenting as inadequate and voting in most states not at all. Rose Schneiderman, one of the most important labor organizers of this period, and a key figure in the Women's Trade Union League, spoke in a 1914 speech about the importance of what she called kitchen table organizing, the way that working women talked each other into solidarity not through formal meetings but through the daily informal conversations of shared living. She had done it herself in the boarding houses where she had lived during her early years in New York City. She had learned at tables not unlike the one on South Halsted Street that the women beside her were not her competition. They were her colleagues, her potential allies. The people who would, if she could only find the right words at the right moment, show up beside her when the moment came to act. And some of them did. Across the boarding houses of New York and Chicago and Boston, women who had talked about wages at the dinner table went on to walk picket lines. Women who had talked about the vote over cold soup went on to march. The table did not make them activists, but it gave them the daily practice of speaking being heard and recognizing that their individual experience was not individual at all. Which brings us with a kind of inevitability to the question of the rules that governed all of this. Because the boarding house table was a relatively free space, freer anyway than the factory floor or the shop counter, but it existed inside a larger system of control and expectation that shaped every hour of a boarding house woman's day. And understanding those rules, where they came from, how they were enforced, and what it actually cost a woman to break them, tells us something essential about the world these women were living in. So let's talk about the curfews. Let's talk about the locked parlours and the barred bedroom doors and the particular exhausting performance of being a respectable woman in an era that made respectability feel like a full-time job on top of the actual full-time job you already had. Because some of these rules will make you smile, and some of them will make you quietly furious, and a few of them, the ones you least expect, will make you think about your own life in ways you might not have anticipated. Let's keep going. 10 o'clock. That was the number that governed the social lives of hundreds of thousands of American women throughout the 1910s. 10 o'clock in the evening, and the front door of the boarding house was locked. Not bolted from the inside as a safety measure against the city outside, though that was the official explanation. Locked as a statement, a declaration, a boundary drawn in iron that said whatever you're doing out there after this hour, we will not be responsible for it, and we will not pretend that it is acceptable. If you were 1 minute past 10, you knocked. You waited. The landlady, or sometimes the landlady's daughter assigned to this particular duty, with all the enthusiasm you might imagine, came to the door, looked at you, noted the time, noted your expression, noted what you were wearing, and whether anything about it suggested you had been somewhere you should not have been. She let you in, and you both understood that this moment had been recorded somewhere in the running ledger of your reputation. If you were more than a few minutes late more than a few times, the conversation that followed was brief and unambiguous. You found other accommodations. Welcome to part 6. Welcome to the rules. Now, before we go any further, I want to make something clear, because I think the easiest thing in the world is to read the rules of boarding house life through a purely modern lens and conclude that they were simply oppressive, that the landladies were wardens, and that the women living under these conditions were passive victims of an unjust system. That reading is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete. An incomplete history, in my experience, is usually the most dangerous kind. So let's try to see the full picture. The curfew was real. The restrictions on male visitors were real. The prohibition on cooking in rooms, on certain kinds of socializing, on behaviors that the broader culture of the 1910s categorized under the elastic and exhausting label of impropriety, all of it was real, enforced, and consequential. A woman who lost her boarding house placement lost more than a bed. She lost her address, her reference, and in many cases her employment, because employers in this era routinely asked for a boarding house address as evidence of stable, respectable lodging. To be without a proper address was to become, in the eyes of the city's employment infrastructure, a question mark. And question marks did not get hired as telephone operators or department store clerks. The rules, in other words, had teeth. Let us not pretend otherwise. The Young Women's Christian Association conducted its most comprehensive survey of boarding house conditions in American cities in the years between 1912 and 1914, gathering data from houses in New York, Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, and 8 other cities. The survey catalogued the rules that houses posted, some formally on printed cards tacked to bedroom doors, others informally communicated only through the landlady's manner and the experience of watching what happened to women who violated them. The most universal rules appearing in virtually every house surveyed were these: a curfew between 9 and 10:30 in the evening on weekdays, male visitors restricted to the parlour only during specified hours with the door left open, no cooking of any kind in the rooms, no loud noise after 9, and no guests, male or female, overnight under any circumstances. Additional rules varied by house and by landlady. Some houses prohibited the reading of certain kinds of newspapers, the more sensational tabloids that were proliferating in cities during this period, on the grounds that they were not appropriate material for respectable young women. Some prohibited any discussion of wages at the table, for reasons that were partly about propriety and partly about something more strategic. A landlady who knew what her boarders earned had significantly more leverage in rent negotiations. Some houses had rules about church attendance, not mandatory, but strongly encouraged in ways that made the line between suggestion and requirement somewhat difficult to locate. And then there were the rules about men. This is the category where the boarding house regulations become simultaneously most fascinating and most revealing about the anxieties of the era. The male visitor rule, parlour only, door open specified hours, was ubiquitous, but the logic behind it was more complicated than simple moral supervision. In the cultural understanding of the 1910s, a woman's virtue, that word with all the freight it carries, was also her economic asset. A woman whose reputation was compromised even by rumour, even by association, lost access to the employment market. The better-paying, more coveted positions available to women in this period, clerical work, teaching upper-floor retail positions, telephone exchange work, all required a character reference, and character in this context was understood almost entirely through the lens of sexual respectability. A woman who was known to entertain men in her room, or to come home after midnight, or to be associated with the wrong kind of social life, could lose her job not because of any formal policy, but because the foreman or the floor manager simply chose not to renew her placement. The landlady who enforced the parlour rule was from a certain angle protecting her boarders' economic futures. From another angle, she was policing their bodies on behalf of a labour market that had decided women's bodies were its business. Both of these things were true at the same time. History is often like that. Let me give you a specific case because abstractions only carry so much weight. In 1916, the Women's Municipal League of Boston, a reform organisation that had been documenting working women's conditions in the city for nearly a decade, published a report on boarding house life that included detailed case studies of women who had lost their housing due to rule violations. One case, identified only as Case 14 to protect the subject's identity, involved a young woman from Worcester, Massachusetts, who'd been living in a boarding house on Tremont Street for 8 months. She was employed as a bookkeeper at a dry goods firm, earned $8 a week, and by all accounts was hard-working and punctual. She began a courtship with a young man she'd met at her church. He walked her home from evening services on Sundays. After several months, he began meeting her at the corner near her boarding house a few evenings a week, and they would walk together before she came in for the evening. She was never late. She never invited him inside. By every observable measure, the courtship was entirely within the bounds of conventional respectability. Her landlady gave her 2 weeks' notice anyway. The reason stated was that the young man had been seen waiting on the corner on 3 occasions, and that this constituted, in the landlady's judgment, an inappropriate attachment that would be disruptive to the house. The Women's Municipal League investigator who documented the case noted with visible frustration that the young woman had done nothing that any reasonable standard of conduct would consider improper, but the landlady's authority within her own house was absolute and there was no appeal. Case 14 found new lodgings within 3 weeks, but at a house that cost 50 cents more per week and was a longer streetcar ride from her workplace. The cost in money and time in the disruption to her carefully balanced budget was entirely hers to absorb. I find that case study almost unbearably instructive, because it illustrates something about the texture of power in this world that statistics alone cannot capture. The rules were not enforced with consistency or with any particular logic beyond the landlady's personal judgment, and that inconsistency was itself a form of control. When the standard is unknowable, the safest response is total compliance. When you cannot predict which behavior will cross an invisible line, you shrink. You make yourself smaller. You become very, very careful. Sound familiar? Here is the thing that I keep wanting to balance against all of this, though, because it would be easy and wrong to leave the picture here. Some boarding houses had almost no restrictive rules at all. The spectrum was genuinely wide. Houses associated with the Young Women's Christian Association, which by the early 1910s was operating boarding accommodations in cities across the country, specifically for working women, tended to be more structured and more rule-bound. The organization's philosophy was explicitly oriented toward creating safe, supervised environments for young women newly arrived in cities, but independent boarding houses run by women who were themselves working class, who had lived the life their boarders were living, sometimes operated by a very different philosophy. Historian Wendy Gamber, whose 1990s research on the boarding house as a cultural institution remains one of the foundational works on this topic, documented houses where the landlady's stated policy was something close to, "I don't ask, you don't tell everyone comes home safe, and we don't discuss things that are nobody's business." In some immigrant communities, particularly where the landlady shared cultural background with her boarders, and where the broader American rules of respectability were understood as external impositions rather than internal values, the household ran on a very different kind of social contract. This matters because it reminds us that the boarding house was not a monolith. It was as varied as the women who ran it and the women who lived in it. And yet, and this is where I want to land for a moment because I think it is the most important point in this entire section, even the most lenient boarding house operated within a broader system that the women inside it did not design and could not escape. A woman could navigate the strictest landlady or the most permissive one. She could adjust her behavior, find creative workarounds, build alliances with sympathetic housemates, learn to read the landlady's moods. Women were extraordinarily resourceful in this regard. The historical record is full of evidence of small daily acts of navigation and resistance that rarely rose to the level of formal documentation, but were absolutely real. What she could not do without genuinely significant cost was simply reject the framework. She could not decide that the curfew did not apply to her. She could not decide that her reputation was her own business. She could not, in most practical senses, choose to live outside the system of respectability that the boarding house enforced, because that system was not just the landlady's invention. It was built into the hiring practices of her employer, the assumptions of her neighbours, the legal structures that gave women almost no formal protections in cases of dispute. The rules were everywhere. The boarding house just happened to be where they were most legible. One small moment before we move on, because I think it is worth pausing on. Among the many documents preserved in the settlement house archives of this period, there is a short letter, undated, unsigned, written on the kind of thin paper that cost almost nothing, that was found tucked inside a copy of the Young Women's Christian Association boarding house handbook at a New York City house that closed sometime around 1918. The letter reads in its entirety, I have followed every rule in this book and it has still not made me happy. But I am still here. I suppose that counts for something. I have no idea who wrote it. I have no idea what happened to her. But I think about that letter more than is probably rational because it seems to me to contain in 2 sentences the entire emotional landscape of boarding house life in the 1910s. The discipline, the survival, and the quiet, stubborn insistence on counting one's own endurance as a form of accomplishment. She was still there. It counted for something. Now, if the rules were about controlling what women did in their hours outside of work, there was an equally powerful set of pressures governing something even more fundamental: the money they had to live on. We touched on the economics of basic survival in part 3, but we have not yet talked about the trap, the specific structural way in which the wages paid to women in this era were calibrated to keep them just solvent enough to keep working, and just precarious enough to keep them from building anything beyond survival. That trap had a shape, it had dimensions, and once you see it clearly, the way these women navigated it, the creativity, the solidarity, the sheer bloody-minded refusal to be entirely defined by it, becomes something close to astonishing. Let's follow the money one more time, but differently than before. There is a word that economists use when they want to describe a system designed to extract maximum labor for minimum cost while keeping the worker just functional enough to return the next morning. The word is subsistence, not poverty necessarily, not destitution, subsistence. The precise calibration of wages to a threshold just above collapse, enough to eat, enough to sleep, enough to show up, but not enough to accumulate, not enough to negotiate, not enough to ever comfortably walk away. In the 1910s, subsistence was not an accident. It was for women workers in American cities a policy, and understanding how that policy worked and how working women pushed back against it in ways that were creative, tenacious, and almost entirely undocumented by the institutions that benefited from it is one of the most important parts of this entire story. Let me start with a number that shocked investigators when they first calculated it, and still shocks me every time I return to it. In 1915, the state of New York published the findings of its Factory Investigating Commission, a body convened in the aftermath of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911, which had killed 146 garment workers, the overwhelming majority of them young immigrant women. The commission had spent 4 years gathering testimony, visiting workplaces and interviewing workers across the state. Among its findings was this: the average annual wage for a woman working in a New York State factory in 1914 was $299. $299 for a full year of work. The Commission also calculated in the same report that the minimum cost of self-supporting life in New York City for a single working woman, rent, food, clothing, and the most basic incidentals was approximately $346 per year. Read those 2 numbers again. The average woman factory worker earned $299. The minimum she needed to survive was $346. The gap between what she was paid and what she needed was $47 a year. She was structurally, mathematically by design, underpaid not as a side effect of market forces, but as a feature of a labour system that had decided women did not need a full living wage because they were not in the cultural imagination of the era truly self-supporting. They were understood to be temporary workers, between their father's house and their husband's house, just passing through. The permanent economy was not built for them, except that, as we have seen, enormous numbers of them were entirely self-supporting, entirely permanent, and entirely trapped in a gap between income and survival that the system had deliberately constructed and consistently refused to close. Now, how did they live inside that gap? This is the question I find most compelling, because the answer reveals something about human ingenuity, under constraint that goes well beyond economics. The first and most important strategy was something that reformers of the era documented but often misread: the deliberate construction of what I would call informal economic networks. These were not formalized. They left almost no paper trail. But they were real, they were extensive, and they functioned with the sophistication that would have impressed any economist if economists had been paying attention. Florence Kelley, the General Secretary of the National Consumers League from 1899 until 1932, and one of the most tireless advocates for working women's rights in American history, observed in her field notes from the early 1910s that working women had developed what she called the arithmetic of mutual aid, a system of small, constant reciprocal economic support that operated entirely outside formal banking or charity structures. A woman who had a good week lent a quarter to a woman who had a bad one. The debt was repaid in kind or in labour, or in the form of future reciprocity when the situation reversed. No interest, no paperwork, no formal accounting. What Kelley understood, and what I think is worth sitting with for a moment, is that this system was not charity. It was not the strong helping the weak. It was a collectively managed financial buffer, a shared cushion against the individual emergencies that the margin-free wages of the era made inevitable. The women running these networks were not performing generosity. They were practicing survival economics with the sophistication that the formal financial system had not yet made available to people in their position. Savings accounts were legally available to women by this period, but practically inaccessible. Many banks required a minimum deposit that represented 2 or 3 weeks of a factory worker's wages, and many women moved cities often enough that maintaining any kind of banking relationship was logistically difficult. So they built their own system, out of quarters and I owe us that were never written down and debts that were honoured because community memory was more reliable than any contract. I find that genuinely extraordinary. The second strategy was more visible and better documented: the deliberate pooling of purchasing power for necessities. We touched briefly on the shared lunch pail in Part 5, but the phenomenon went considerably further than sandwiches. Women in boarding houses and in the neighbourhoods around them organised what contemporaries sometimes called shopping clubs, informal arrangements in which 3 or 4 women would pool their weekly budget for specific purchases, buying in larger quantities than any individual could afford and dividing both the goods and the cost. Soap bought in bulk, fabric purchased collectively to be divided and sewn into work clothes, shoes sometimes purchased second-hand from an exchange market run out of a church basement or settlement house, bought by women who had different shoe sizes but the same shoe budget, who negotiated trades and timing with the pragmatic creativity of people for whom every penny genuinely mattered. The settlement houseworker Lillian Wald, who ran the Henry Street settlement in New York's Lower East Side, and documented the lives of working women in that neighbourhood with extraordinary specificity throughout the 1910s, wrote about one particular group of 4 women, all employed at nearby laundry, who had developed a rotating purchase system for winter coats. Each autumn, one of the 4 would buy a new coat. The other 3 would buy second-hand. The following autumn, the rotation advanced. Over 4 years, each woman got 1 new coat and 3 years of wearing coats that had been broken in and were still in good condition. The total cost to each woman was significantly less than buying a new coat every year, and significantly more dignified than wearing the same coat until it fell apart, which was the only other option most of them had. 4 women, 1 coat rotation, a 4-year plan built on nothing but trust, and the shared understanding that their situations were identical and their interests were aligned. I keep coming back to that detail because it captures something that I think is easy to miss when we look at the economic history of this period from the outside. We see the poverty, we see the structural inequality, We see the system that was designed to keep women in exactly the position they were in, and all of that is real, and all of it deserves to be named clearly. But inside that system, these women were not passive. They were not simply enduring. They were building carefully, incrementally, with the materials available to them, something that functioned like economic agency, even when formal economic agency was denied to them. Pause for a second and think about that. Has there been a time in your own life when the official system simply was not going to help you, and you had to figure out something that worked anyway? Most of us have had at least one moment like that. For these women, that moment was every single week, every single month, every single year. Now let me talk about the trap's other dimension, because so far we have mostly discussed the wage side, but the trap had another jaw, and it operated through a mechanism that was simultaneously more personal and more insidious, the way the system made advancement structurally difficult for women in ways it did not make difficult for men in comparable positions. Consider this. A young man working as a clerk in a department store in 1913 could expect, if he performed well, to be promoted to a supervisory position within a few years. That supervisory position paid significantly more. It came with a title, it came with authority, and it came with the implicit promise of continued advancement. A young woman in the identical position, same store, same hours, same quality of work, was not on the same track. Women were not as a formal matter of store policy in most major retail establishments, of the period eligible for supervisory positions over mixed gender departments. They could be promoted to head of a women's section. They could become floor supervisors in departments staffed entirely by women. But the management track that led to real authority, real wage increases, real accumulation of economic power, that track was in most industries simply not available to them. Not because of individual prejudice, though. Individual prejudice certainly existed, but because of formal, explicit institutional policy that had been designed with the assumption that women were temporary workers who would leave when they married. The Consumers League of New York documented this pattern in a 1913 study of department store employment that remains one of the most detailed analyses of the period. What the investigators found was a labour market in which women's wages were essentially flat. The women who had been at the same store for 5 years earned on average only slightly more than women who had been there for 1 year, because the mechanisms through which men's wages grew over time, promotion, seniority increases, negotiated raises, simply did not function the same way for women. Experience did not reliably translate into income for women the way it did for men. This is not ancient history. I am aware that some of what I just described will sound to some of you uncomfortably familiar. I'm going to leave that observation where it is and let you do whatever you want with it. What I want to focus on is what some of these women did in response, because here is where the story takes a turn that I find genuinely inspiring, not in a sentimental way, but in the hard, specific, documented way that real history is inspiring when you pay close attention to it. Some of them organized, not all of them. The barriers to union organizing for women in this period were enormous, legal, social, economic, and in some cases physical. The women who tried to organize their workplaces risked immediate dismissal, blacklisting from their industry, and in some documented cases the kind of coordinated employer retaliation that made continued employment in an entire city difficult. These were not abstract risks. Women had lost jobs, lost housing, and in a few documented cases lost significantly more for the act of standing up in a workplace and asking for wages commensurate with their labour. And yet, Clara Lemlich was 23 years old in 1909 when she stood up at a mass meeting at Cooper Union in New York City and called in Yiddish for an immediate general strike of the garment workers. What followed the uprising of the 20,000, which is what historians eventually named it, was the largest strike of women workers in American history to that date. For 13 weeks between 20,000 and 40,000, women, mostly young, mostly immigrant, mostly living in boarding houses or cramped family apartments on the Lower East Side, walked picket lines in the winter, cold earning no wages, surviving on strike relief funds that covered a fraction of their expenses, and holding out for wages, hours, and conditions that a human being could actually live on. Clara Lemlich, at the time of that speech, was living in a boarding house in the garment district. She had been beaten on a picket line 6 times before that November evening. She had 6 broken ribs. She stood up anyway. The strike did not win everything it demanded. The gains were partial, the settlements uneven, and within 2 years the Triangle factory fire would demonstrate with horrifying clarity how much remained undone. But in the years that followed the uprising of the 20,000 union membership among women garment workers in New York increased dramatically. Wages in the industry rose for thousands of workers, and the political landscape of women's labour organising shifted in ways that created the foundation for changes that would take decades more to fully arrive. Clara Lemlich never went back to garment work after the organising years. She went on to spend the rest of her long life, she lived to 96, as an activist and organiser, and a voice for working people in every arena she could find. She died in 1982 in a nursing home in Los Angeles, where by multiple accounts she was still organising her fellow residents. She was still there, right up until the end, and it counted for something that I am still not sure we have fully measured. Which brings us to a dimension of boarding house life we've not yet touched on, and it is one that, depending on your own experiences, you may find surprising or recognisable or both. Because so far we have talked mostly about the public life of the boarding house, the table, the rules, the economics, but behind all of that was a more private world, one involving desire courtship and the extraordinary double standard that governed what women and men were permitted to want to pursue and to be judged for when they pursued it. Romance in the boarding house. The rules of love in an era that had a very specific idea of who love was allowed to belong to. Let's go there. There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not announce itself. It is not the loud, dramatic loneliness of being completely alone in a city where you know nobody. You can feel that kind in your first week, and it is terrible, but at least it is honest about what it is. The lonelier kind, the one I want to talk about in this part, is the loneliness of being surrounded by people doing everything correctly, following every rule, and still feeling in the quiet moments before sleep like something essential is being withheld from you. For the women of the 1910s boarding house, that something was often this: the freedom to want someone. To pursue that wanting without an audience. To make mistakes in love without those mistakes becoming public record. To be in the private corners of your own heart simply a person who desired another person, without that desire being immediately categorized, evaluated, and potentially used against you. The world they were living in had a very efficient system for managing women's romantic lives. It was called reputation, and in the boarding house, reputation was a collective enterprise. Let us be specific about what courtship actually looked like for a working woman in a boarding house in, say, 1914. The geography of romance was extraordinarily compressed. You met people at work, at church, at the Nickelodeon on a Saturday evening, at the settlement house dances that reformers organised with the dual purpose of providing supervised entertainment and keeping young women away from commercial dance halls, which were considered morally suspect. If you met a young man you liked, the courtship had very few venues. You could walk together. You could sit together in the parlour of the boarding house door open during the specified visiting hours, which, as we discussed, were usually somewhere between 6 and 8 in the evening, on weekdays, slightly longer on Sundays. You could meet for a meal, though this required money that many women simply did not have, and that was largely it. The distance between the parlour sitting and marriage was supposed to be short, visible and legible to everyone around you. Any deviation from that prescribed trajectory, any courtship that lingered too long without progressing toward formal engagement, any young man who appeared more than occasionally without declared intentions, any woman who seemed to be enjoying the company of men without moving purposefully toward the altar, attracted exactly the kind of attention that could damage a woman standing in the house, in her workplace and in her neighbourhood. The social purity movement, which had been gathering force since the 1880s and reached significant cultural influence in the 1910s, provided the ideological framework for this surveillance. Its central argument that women's sexual virtue is not merely a personal matter, but a social good that required community protection, had been absorbed into the assumptions of respectable boarding house life so thoroughly that most landladies enforcing visitor rules probably did not think of themselves as ideological actors. They were simply maintaining standards. But standards, as the historian Estelle Friedman has documented in her research on female sexuality and social control in progressive-era America, do not maintain themselves. They require constant daily enforcement by real people making real decisions about other real people's lives. And here is the double standard that I want to sit with for a moment, because I find it genuinely maddening even at 100 years remove. The men who visited the parlours of boarding houses in the 1910s were not subject to equivalent scrutiny. A young man who was known to be courting multiple women simultaneously was not disqualified from respectable society. A young man who delayed commitment, who enjoyed female company without being ready for engagement, who visited a woman's boarding house parlour for weeks, and then stopped visiting without explanation, he might be thought a cad by the woman he left behind, but he faced no formal social consequences. His employment was not at risk. His lodgings were not threatened. His reputation in the structural sense that mattered economically remained intact. The woman he left behind could not say the same. She had been seen with him, in the parlour, in the street, at church. The visibility that made courtship legible and therefore respectable in the eyes of the community was the same visibility that created the record of association, a record that now in his absence hung over her and required management. She had to be seen to handle the end of the courtship with decorum. Too much visible distress suggested she'd been too attached too quickly. Too little visible distress raised different questions. The performance required of her was extraordinarily precise, and it was required of her alone. He went on with his life. She managed the residue of the connection. I want to give you a real story here, because the abstract frustration of this double standard becomes something else entirely when you put a name and a face to it. Her name was Leonora O'Reilly. Not the famous Leonora O'Reilly, the labour organiser, but a different woman of the same name documented in the case files of the Charity Organization Society of New York from 1913. She was 26, worked as a machine operator in a paper box factory in Lower Manhattan, and had been living in a boarding house on West 23rd Street for 2 years. By the account of the social worker who documented her case, she was reliable, hard-working, and well-regarded by both her employer and her landlady. In the spring of 1913, she began a courtship with a young man she had met through her church's social club. The courtship lasted approximately 7 months. He visited the parlour of her boarding house perhaps a dozen times. He walked her home from church on Sundays. He sent her on one occasion a small gift, a hair comb documented in the case file, with the peculiar thoroughness of social welfare record-keeping. In October of 1913 he stopped coming. No formal ending, no conversation. He simply was not there anymore. What followed for Leonora was a cascade of small social erosions that the case file documents with painful clarity. Her landlady, who had watched the courtship with evident approval, now watched her with a different kind of attention. The other women at the table who had offered advice asked questions invested in the story of Leonora, and this young man now offered a different kind of attention too, not cruel most of it, but relentless. The questions about how she was doing, the gentle suggestions that there would be other young men, the particular exhausting sympathy of people who had witnessed something you would have preferred to experience privately. She was not allowed to simply feel what she felt in her own time. The community that had made her courtship visible now made her loss visible too, with equal thoroughness and equal unself-consciousness. She left the boarding house 4 months later, found a position in a different factory in a neighbourhood where nobody knew her, and started again. What strikes me about Leonora's story, and it strikes me every time, is not the loss itself. Loss is loss, and it happens to everyone. What strikes me is the structural loneliness of her situation. She had no private space in which to experience a private grief. The boarding house, for all the genuine community it provided, was also a space in which certain kinds of interiority were simply not available. Everything that happened to you in front of an audience, and an audience, however well-meaning, changes the experience of the thing being witnessed. Now, because I do not want to leave you with the impression that romance in the boarding house was purely a landscape of surveillance and loss, let me tell you about the other side. By the 19-teens, the landscape of urban courtship was actually changing in ways that gave women somewhat more agency than the previous generation had possessed. The rise of commercial amusement Nickelodeons, dance halls, amusement parks, vaudeville theatres created public spaces where mixed-gender socialising happened outside of the formal parlour structure, outside of the landlady's sightline, and outside of the church social framework. Historians Beth Bailey and Kathy Pace have both documented how this shift created what Pace called a new heterosocial culture, spaces and practices in which women and men mix socially in ways that had not previously been normalised. The dance hall is worth pausing on because it was simultaneously beloved by working women and deeply alarming to reformers, and the gap between those two responses tells you something important about whose perspective of women's lives we have historically found most credible. Commercial dance halls in cities like New York, Chicago and Boston were by around 1910 a significant part of working-class social life. A survey conducted by the National League of Girls Clubs in 1914 found that in New York City alone there were approximately 500 commercial dance halls, hosting an estimated 100,000 young people on a typical Saturday night. The majority of the women attending these halls were working. Women factory workers, shop girls, telephone operators, who had spent their week under constant supervision at work and under the landlady's eye at home, and who arrived at the dance hall on Saturday evening with a straightforward interest in music movement and the company of other young people who were not their co-workers or their housemates. What the reform literature of the era characterized as moral danger, many of these women characterized as the first genuinely free hours of their week. That gap in perception between the reformers documenting the dance halls and the women attending them is one of the most instructive gaps in all of progressive era history. It reveals with uncomfortable clarity who got to define what was dangerous for whom. I do not want to idealize the dance halls. Some of what happened in and around them was genuinely dangerous for women who had few resources and no formal protections if things went wrong. That is real. But the impulse that drove hundreds of thousands of young working women to those halls on Saturday nights, the impulse toward pleasure, toward self-expression, toward the experience of being young in a body that could move and be moved, was not pathological. It was human, fully, completely, irreducibly human. And the boarding house, for all its rules and its surveillance, was also where women came home from the dance hall, where they whispered in the dark about what had happened, where they borrowed each other's better dress on a Friday afternoon and returned it on a Sunday night with a story attached to it, where the private life imperfect compressed negotiated still managed to exist, Which brings us to something that the history almost always overlooks because it is harder to document than rules and wages and dance halls. Something that happened in the boarding house between women who'd been living alongside each other for months or years, the texture of friendship, the bonds of rivalry and the complicated, beautiful, sometimes devastating dynamics of what happened when a group of women were thrown together by circumstance and had to figure out how to live. Because what happened between the boarders themselves, not between them and the landlady, not between them and the men in their lives, but among themselves, is, I would argue, one of the most fascinating and least examined parts of this entire story. And that is exactly where we are going next. Ask yourself something before we begin. Think of the person in your life, not a family member, not a romantic partner, but the one friend who has known you through the worst of it, the one who saw you at your least put together and stayed anyway, the one whose particular laugh you would recognize in a crowded room, the one whose betrayal, if it ever came, would hurt more than almost anything else could. Now ask yourself, how did that friendship actually start? Not the story you tell at dinner parties, the charming version, but the real version. The version where it probably began with proximity, with being in the same place at the same time repeatedly, until familiarity became comfort and comfort became trust, and trust became something you would not trade for much of anything. For the women of the 1910s boarding house, that process was happening constantly in compressed time with complete strangers in a space the size of someone's living room. The friendships that formed under those conditions were some of the most intense, most consequential, and most poorly documented relationships in American women's history. And so were the rivalries, and so were the betrayals. Let's spend some time with all three. The sociologist Frances Donovan spent 2 years in the early 1920s working as a waitress and a department store clerk in Chicago, embedded among the working women whose lives she was studying, one of the earliest examples of what we would now call participant observation research. Her 1929 book on the lives of working women draws heavily on the boarding house community she encountered during those years, and her observations about female friendship in close quarters are some of the most honest and nuanced primary sources we have. What Donovan found was that boarding house friendships formed along two distinct axes that were sometimes the same axis and sometimes in direct tension with each other. The first was solidarity, pure, practical, non-sentimental solidarity. Women in boarding houses helped each other find jobs. They shared information about which factory foremen were decent and which were not. They covered for each other with landladies during illness, lending each other the appearance of normalcy, getting a sick woman's laundry, done answering for her at dinner, with some vague explanation, so that a few days of genuine illness would not result in the loss of a room. They lent money, shared food, and passed along clothing through informal networks that functioned with the efficiency of a well-run second-hand market. This solidarity was real, and I do not want to romanticize it. It was not primarily about warmth, though warmth existed. It was primarily about survival. Women helped each other because the margin for individual failure was so thin that mutual support was not a luxury, it was a rational response to shared precarity. But the second axis was more complicated competition. Because here is the thing that gets left out of the romantic version of working women's history. The boarding house was not a sisterhood, operating outside the pressures of the world. It was inside those pressures, and the world these women lived in had structured their opportunities in ways that sometimes put them in direct competition with each other. Competition for the better-paying positions at a shared factory. Competition for the landlady's favour, which could mean a warmer room, a slightly larger portion, a little flexibility on the rent due date during a hard week. Competition sometimes for the same young man. Competition most insidiously for the social standing that determined how the other women at the table looked at you, and what that look was worth when you needed something from them. Donovan documented one case she called her subject Anna, that I find particularly illuminating precisely because it is so recognizable. Anna had been at a boarding house on Chicago's North Side for about a year when a new woman arrived. The new woman was younger, from a slightly more educated background, and quickly became the landlady's particular favorite. Within a month, the new woman had the best chair in the parlor, the best seat at the table, and the landlady's ear in ways that Anna had taken a year to cultivate. Anna did not confront anyone. She did not make a scene. She did what most women in her position did in an era when open conflict carried enormous social risk. She managed the situation through the precise, patient, exhausting work of social navigation. She aligned herself more carefully with the other women who also felt displaced. She became more useful, more pleasant, more indispensable in the small daily exchanges that constituted social capital in the house. She waited. The new woman left after 5 months, having found better lodgings closer to her new workplace. Anna remained. The landlady's attention reoriented itself. The chair and the table seat returned to their previous arrangement more or less. Nothing dramatic had happened. Nobody had been cruel. Nobody had done anything that would have been reportable to anyone. And yet the psychological labour that Anna had expended across those 5 months, the constant monitoring, the careful calibration, the suppression of whatever she actually felt, in favour of whatever was strategically appropriate to display, was entirely real, entirely invisible, and entirely uncompensated. I wonder sometimes, reading cases like Anna's, how much of women's energy in this period was spent on exactly this kind of work. The management of social surfaces, the performance of equanimity in the face of circumstances that warranted something rather more emphatic. The particular relentless labour of being a woman in a space that required you to be strategic about even your most ordinary human reactions. But now the betrayals, because I promised you those and they deserve their own moment. The most documented form of betrayal in boarding house life was information, specifically what one woman told the landlady about another, in a space where the landlady held such practical power over your daily existence. Information about a fellow boarder was currency. A woman who reported to the landlady that another woman had come home unusually late, or had received a visitor under ambiguous circumstances, or had been overheard crying on a Sunday night, such a woman had made a deposit in a social account that the landlady might draw on later in her favour. Perhaps the landlady would be more lenient when her own rent was 3 days late. Perhaps she would get first consideration when the better room opened up. The settlement house records of this period, particularly the extensive case documentation from Chicago's United Charities organization, which operated throughout the 1910s, contain multiple instances of women who were asked to leave their boarding houses based on information provided by fellow residents. In some cases, the information was accurate. In others, it was embellished or manufactured outright, the motives ranging from genuine moral disapproval to straightforward competition to personal grievance. The landlady had no way of knowing which category she was dealing with, and in practice the distinction often did not matter. The information arrived, the consequences followed. This is uncomfortable to write about because it runs against the grain of how we want working-class women's history to look. We want the solidarity. We want the mutual aid. We want the circle of women who lifted each other up against the weight of an unjust world. And all of that was real. I have documented it across every part of this series because it was real and it mattered enormously. But the betrayals were also real. And pretending they were not does a disservice both to the women who experienced them and to the actual complexity of human beings under pressure. Because here is what I think the betrayals actually tell us. When you look at them clearly, they tell us how thin the margin was. When the stakes are low enough, most people can afford generosity without calculation. When the stakes are high enough, when a room, A reputation, a week's worth of rent are genuinely on the line. Even good people start doing the arithmetic. The women who informed on each other were not monsters. They were people operating inside a system that had deliberately made their individual situations precarious enough that looking out for themselves sometimes meant not looking out for someone else. The system created the conditions. The women made choices within those conditions. Both of those things are true at the same time. Let me give you one more story before we move forward. This one comes from the records of the Travelers' Aid Society of Philadelphia, an organization that assisted women arriving alone in the city throughout the Progressive era, and it is documented in their annual report from 1916. 2 women arrived in Philadelphia within a week of each other in the autumn of 1914. Both were from rural Pennsylvania, both were looking for factory work, and both ended up at the same boarding house on Vine Street. The Travelers' Aid worker who later interviewed them described how, by the account of both women, the first months had been a genuine friendship, the kind of sudden, total intimacy that isolation and proximity can produce. They found work at the same bindery. They walked to work together every morning. They ate at the same end of the table and talked late into the evenings in a way that the other women at the house apparently found either touching or mildly annoying depending on who you asked. Then one of them, the report calls her the second woman, got a promotion. A small one, a slightly higher skilled position, a few cents more per hour. Nothing that would change her life materially, but something that changed the texture between them. The first woman did not get promoted. She had been at the bindery longer. She had by her own account believed she was equally skilled. And the promotion passed to someone who had been there less time by a supervisor who had reasons of his own that may or may not have had anything to do with the quality of the work. The 2 women stopped walking to work together. They stopped eating at the same end of the table. They were still at the same house, eating the same meals, sleeping in rooms separated by a thin wall, and they had gone from total intimacy to something that the Travelers' Aid worker described with characteristic, bureaucratic understatement as a state of some coolness. Neither of them left. Neither of them found a new house or a new job or a new arrangement. They simply renegotiated the relationship from something open into something guarded in the way that adults learn to do when the original terms of a connection have shifted, and neither person has the emotional energy or the economic freedom to simply walk away. They remained at the same house for another year and a half. Occasionally, by the workers' account, they were seen talking together in the parlour in the evenings, and it seemed at those moments like the old warmth was still somewhere underneath. But neither of them went back to what they had been. I think about those 2 women sometimes. I think about how much they had needed each other when they arrived, and I think about how the same system that had thrown them together, the precariousness, the limited options, the narrow economics, had also created the conditions for the specific friction that pulled them apart. The promotion was not really about the promotion. It was about everything the promotion represented in a world where advancement was so rare and so unequally distributed that even a few cents an hour between friends could crack something open. They deserved better than a world that put them in that position, both of them. And here is where I want to pivot, because there is a chapter of this story that we have been building toward across the entire series, one that puts everything we have discussed in a larger frame. The dining table politics, the economic trap, the solidarity and the rivalry, the daily performance of respectability, all of it was happening inside a specific historical moment, a decade of enormous political upheaval, when the question of whether women would get the vote was moving from a distant aspiration to an imminent reality. And the boarding house was not separate from that political world. It was in ways that historians are still mapping one of the places where that world was being made. The connection between the boarding house and the suffrage movement, between the women we've been following through their daily lives and the political transformation that would arrive at the end of this decade, is more direct than you might think. and it is where we are heading right now. August 18th, 1920. That is the date the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified. The amendment that finally, after more than 70 years of organized effort, extended the right to vote to women. It passed by a single vote in the Tennessee state legislature, cast by a 24-year-old representative named Harry Byrne, who changed his position at the last moment after receiving a letter from his mother that morning, urging him to do the right thing. One vote, one letter, one mother. History is often decided by smaller margins than we imagine, but the focus on that one dramatic moment in Nashville obscures something I find far more interesting: the decades of unglamorous, invisible daily work that made that moment possible. And a significant portion of that work happened not in the grand halls of political organizing, not at the podiums of suffrage conventions, but in the parlors and dining rooms and narrow stairwells of boarding houses in cities across America. That connection between the working women of the boarding house world and the political transformation of the suffrage decade is what I want to trace in this part, because it is more direct than most people realize and more complicated than the standard suffrage narrative tends to acknowledge. Let me start with a fact that tends to surprise people when they first encounter it. The suffrage movement of the 1910s was not a unified movement. It was a coalition of factions that agreed on the goal and frequently disagreed, sometimes fiercely, on almost everything else: strategy, tactics, timing, which women the movement actually spoke for, and whether the vote once won would be followed by the broader economic and social reforms that working women needed most. The mainstream suffrage organizations, the National American Woman Suffrage Association, led in this period by Carrie Chapman Catt, whose winning plan of 1916 focused on state-by-state legislative campaigns, were primarily composed of middle-class and upper-middle-class women, educated women, women with time and money to devote to political organizing, women who for the most part did not live in boarding houses. But there was another wing of the suffrage movement less celebrated in the standard historical narrative that was rooted in exactly the world we've been exploring. The Labour-link suffragists women who came to the vote not as an abstract principle of democratic equality, but as a practical instrument for improving the conditions of working life, operated out of trade unions, settlement houses, and yes, the boarding house networks that connected working women across neighborhoods and across cities. The Women's Trade Union League, which we encountered in Part 7 through the work of Rose Schneiderman, was one of the organizational bridges between the labor world and the suffrage world. Its membership in the 1910s was heavily composed of working women: garment workers, laundry workers, telephone operators, retail clerks, many of whom lived in boarding houses or had recently moved out of them, and its argument for women's suffrage was explicitly economic. Without the vote working, women had no mechanism to hold legislators accountable for the conditions they worked in. The vote was not an end in itself. It was a tool, a lever, something you needed in order to do the rest of the work. This distinction matters more than it might initially seem because it shaped how different women understood the significance of August 18, 1920. For the middle-class suffragist, the ratification of the 19th Amendment was the culmination the thing itself finally achieved. For many working women it was a beginning, an instrument finally in hand. The question was what you did with it next. Now let me bring this into the specific geography of the boarding house, because the connection is more concrete than just shared organizational membership. Historian Ellen Carroll Dubois, in her work on the suffrage movement's labor roots, documented the way that boarding house communities functioned as informal political education networks throughout the 1910s. Women who shared a house brought home, along with their wages and their tired feet, the political conversations of their workplaces. A woman who had attended a Women's Trade Union League meeting on a Tuesday evening came back to the dinner table with arguments with outrage, with the particular energizing anger that comes from sitting in a room full of people who share your circumstances and are finally talking about them clearly. The dinner table, which we discussed in Part 5 as a space for practical information exchange, was also in this period a space for political conversion, not in the dramatic sudden sense of a road to Damascus moment, in the slow accumulating sense of a consciousness that shifts through repeated exposure to ideas that resonate with lived experience. A woman who had spent years watching men with equivalent skills earn more and advance faster, who had navigated the curfew and the parlour rules, and the reputation system we discussed did not need a particularly elaborate argument to understand why women needed political representation. The argument was her daily life. The boarding house had already made the case. The suffragist or labour organiser who found her at the dinner table was in many cases simply providing language and framework for something she already knew. Let me give you a specific and remarkable woman to put at the centre of this. Leonora O'Reilly this time, the famous one, the actual labour organiser, grew up in a tenement on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and went to work in a shirtwaist factory at the age of 11. By her late teens she was organising, and by the time she was in her 30s in the 1910s, she was one of the most compelling voices at the intersection of the labour movement and the suffrage movement in America. She testified before the New York State Legislature in 1912, arguing for women's suffrage in terms so grounded in the specific economic reality of working women's lives that even the legislators who opposed her described her testimony as unusually powerful. What is relevant to our story is where she spent much of her early adult life in boarding houses on the Lower East Side and in the surrounding neighbourhoods, living alongside the women she was organising, sharing their conditions, eating at the same tables. Her political education was not abstract, it was spatial. It happened in specific rooms around specific meals in the company of specific women who were doing the arithmetic of their own lives and arriving at the same conclusion she was arriving at by slightly different routes every single evening. She said in a speech preserved in the Labour archives that the boarding house table was where she first understood what solidarity actually meant in practice. Not as a slogan, not as an ideal, but as the specific act of passing the bread to someone whose hands are too tired to reach for it themselves. Passing the bread. I have been thinking about that image since I first read it. The suffrage decade in America, roughly 1910 to 1920, was also the decade of the boarding house's greatest cultural presence. The two phenomena overlapped not coincidentally but causally. The same forces that had driven millions of women into the paid workforce and into urban boarding house life industrialization migration, the disruption of the traditional family economy, had also created the conditions under which women's political claims became increasingly difficult to dismiss. You could not simultaneously depend on women's labour to run your factories and your department stores and your telephone exchanges, and also maintain with a straight face that those women had no stake in the laws that govern their lives. The argument collapsed under its own weight. It just took 70 years and an enormous amount of organised effort to make it collapse. And some of that effort was made at boarding house tables in boarding house parlours by women in their off hours who were too tired to be doing what they were doing, but did it anyway because they had talked themselves and each other into understanding what was at stake. There is something I want to say carefully here because I think it is important and I do not want to get it wrong. The suffrage movement, even in its labour-linked form, had significant blind spots. The 19th Amendment, when it passed, did not extend equal voting rights to all women in practice. African American women in the South faced the same voter suppression mechanisms that had denied African American men the effective exercise of their constitutional rights since Reconstruction literacy tests, poll taxes, intimidation violence. Native American women were in many cases not yet citizens, and therefore not covered by the amendment at all. The activism of African American women suffragists like Ida B. Wells, who'd been arguing for decades that the suffrage movement needed to confront its own racial exclusions, was frequently sidelined by a mainstream movement that calculated correctly that Southern white support was politically necessary for passage and was willing to trade equity for strategy. That is a real failure. It deserves to be named clearly and not footnoted. The boarding house world we've been exploring was itself racially segregated. As I noted briefly in Part 1, African American women and white women lived in separate houses in virtually every American city of this period. The political world that these women inhabited was equally segregated, and the vote that finally arrived in August of 1920 arrived unevenly in ways that took decades more to begin to correct. I think you can hold both of those things at once, the genuine achievement of the 19th Amendment and the genuine inadequacy of how it was pursued and what it delivered to different women. History requires us to do that kind of holding. It is one of the things that makes it harder than either the triumphant version or the purely critical version, and more honest than both. Now let me bring this back to the specific texture of boarding house life in the suffrage decade, because there is one more piece of this story I want to share before we move forward. In cities where suffrage organising was active in the early 19-teens, New York, Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, suffrage workers deliberately targeted boarding house communities as organising venues. They understood that these houses concentrated exactly the kind of women they most needed to reach self-supporting urban politically unaffiliated and already in daily proximity with each other in ways that made collective conversation natural. The National American Woman Suffrage Association's records from this period include field reports from organisers who describe going door to door in working-class boarding house neighbourhoods, asking landladies for permission to hold small meetings in parlours on weekday evenings. Some landladies refused the no politics rule that many houses observed was genuinely enforced. Some agreed, particularly when the organisers were skilled at framing the meetings as practical civic education rather than activism. What the organisers reported finding in house after house was not indifference. It was not the passive disengagement from politics that the era's cultural narrative attributed to working women. It was a readiness, a quickness of response to arguments that connected the vote to wages, to working conditions, to the specific daily indignities of a life lived under rules they had no hand in making. These women were already organised in the most fundamental sense. They already lived in community. They already talked every evening about their shared circumstances. The suffrage organiser did not need to build that community from scratch. She just needed to walk through the front door, which is, when you think about it, exactly the same thing every woman who arrived at a boarding house had done. Walked through the front door and found on the other side a world that was more complicated and more alive than anything she had been told to expect. We are nearly at the end of this story now. There are two parts remaining, and they are, I think, the most personal and the most resonant of everything we have covered, because they bring us from the political world back to the individual, back to the question that has been underneath everything from the very beginning: what actually happened to these women? Where did they go, and what did they carry with them when they finally left, the women who broke the rules? The ones who refused the framework entirely, or bent it until it cracked, or navigated around it in ways that cost them things they could never fully get back. Their stories are next, and they are something else entirely. The rule breakers are the ones history tends to remember, if it remembers them at all, in one of two ways. Either they become heroines, the brave rebels who defied convention and changed the world, cleaned up for posterity into something more legible than they actually were, or they become cautionary tales, women whose stories get told primarily as warnings, the point of the telling being what happened to them rather than who they were. What gets lost in both versions is the actual texture of what it meant to break the rules of boarding house life in the 1910s, the specific calculations involved, the specific costs, and the specific complicated question of whether the word breaking is even the right word for what most of these women were doing, because a lot of what looked like defiance from the outside was from the inside simply a woman trying to live in a way that felt honest to her, in a world that kept insisting her honesty was a problem. Let me tell you about 3 women. Real ones, all documented in the historical record, all living in, or recently departed from boarding houses, all navigating the gap between what was expected and what was actually true for them, all arriving at different destinations by different routes. The first woman is Margaret Sanger. Not the version of Margaret Sanger you may have encountered in a high school history class, the simplified icon flattened by posterity into a single issue. The actual Margaret Sanger of the 1910s was a 30-something visiting nurse from a working-class Irish Catholic family in Corning, New York, who had moved to New York City with her husband and children, become radicalized by what she saw in the tenements of the Lower East Side, and begun writing and distributing information about birth control at a time when the Comstock Law's federal obscenity statutes that had been on the books since 1873 made it a federal crime to distribute any information about contraception through the mail. What is relevant to the boarding house story is this. In 1916, Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in the United States in the Brownsville neighborhood of Brooklyn. The women who came to that clinic in its first weeks of operation before it was raided by police, and Sanger was arrested, which happened after 9 days, were overwhelmingly working-class women, many of them living in exactly the conditions we've been describing throughout this series. Women for whom an unplanned pregnancy was not an inconvenience but a catastrophe. Women for whom the economics of boarding house life, already so precarious, would have been rendered completely impossible by a child born without the support of a partner or a family. The Comstock laws which Sanger was violating with full knowledge and deliberate intent were also the laws that determined what a woman in a boarding house was allowed to know about managing her own reproductive life. They were enforced not by boarding house landladies but by federal postal inspectors and local police. But they operated in the same cultural space as the parlor rules and the curfews. They were part of the same architecture of control over women's bodies and women's choices that shaped every dimension of boarding house existence. Sanger was arrested. She was convicted. She served 30 days in a workhouse, and she kept going. The organization she founded eventually became Planned Parenthood. The legal battles she initiated eventually produced decades later the Supreme Court decisions that established the constitutional right to contraception. The line from the Brownsville Clinic in 1916 to those decisions is not straight. Nothing in history is straight, but it is real and it is traceable. She was not by most measures a woman who played by the rules. She paid significant costs for not playing by them, and the world is materially different because she did not. The second woman I want to tell you about is Eunice Hunton Carter. Eunice Carter was born in 1899 in Atlanta, Georgia, the daughter of 2 prominent African-American community leaders and activists. She grew up in Boston after her family relocated, attended Simmons College, and later earned a law degree from Fordham University, one of the very few women to do so in the 1920s, and one of an even smaller number of African-American women in that group. What brings her into the boarding house story is the world she navigated as a young woman in the 1910s before her legal career, as a young educated African-American woman in a northern city during the peak years of the Great Migration. Eunice Carter was living in exactly the racially segregated boarding house universe I described briefly in Part 1. The houses available to her and to women like her were in African-American neighborhoods. Harlem in New York, Bronzeville in Chicago, the Hill District in Pittsburgh. These communities had developed their own boarding house culture, their own networks, their own landladies, and their own rules, operating in deliberate parallel to but structurally separate from the white working-class boarding house world. The specific rule that Eunice Carter broke, if we're going to use that word, was the rule of expected limitation, the unwritten but thoroughly understood expectation that a black woman in America in the 1910s, however educated and however capable, should calibrate her ambitions to fit within the narrow space that the broader society was willing to allow her to occupy. She declined that calibration entirely and consistently. She became in 1935 the first African-American woman to serve as an assistant district attorney in New York State. She was the only woman on the team that prosecuted Lucky Luciano, one of the most significant organized crime prosecutions of the 20th century. She identified the pattern in the evidence that cracked the case open in a moment her male colleagues had missed and continued to dismiss until she made them see it. The boarding house world she'd passed through as a young woman, the segregated, constrained, rigorously structured world of the African-American boarding house in the 1910s had not produced her ambition. That was hers, and it came from the home she was raised in and the parents who shaped her. But the boarding house years had given her something else, a very precise education in how systems work, what rules actually protect and what they actually prevent, and how to move through a world that was not designed for you, with enough intelligence and patience and strategic clarity to eventually change it. The third woman is harder to name because she is not famous. She appears in the records of the Chicago Erring Women's Refuge, an organization that provided housing and support to women in crisis, in a single case file from 1914. She's identified only as Miss V, age 21, formerly employed in the garment trade. Miss V had been living in a boarding house on the west side of Chicago. She had a boyfriend. The boyfriend was not in the parlor hours door open framework, a permitted presence in her life in the ways that she needed him to be. She made choices. Those choices discovered by the landlady cost her the room. Then, as the cascade of consequences that the case file traces with its characteristic combination of clinical precision and human detail cost her the job because the factory foreman who employed her knew the landlady, and the landlady had opinions, and the foreman had a ready excuse to let go of a worker who had become in his calculation more trouble than her wages were worth. Miss V ended up at the Erring Women's Refuge not because she had done anything that she herself considered wrong, the case file notes carefully, but because the combined weight of a landlady's judgment and an employer's convenience had removed the scaffolding of her life in a matter of weeks. The word the social worker used to describe Miss V's state of mind at intake was not distressed. It was not remorseful. It was, and I think this word was chosen with some care, determined. She was determined. She had lost her room, her job, and a significant portion of her reputation in the neighborhood. She was 21 years old, and she had approximately $4 to her name. She was also the case file notes at the end of its account of her stay at the refuge, employed at a new factory within 6 weeks, at a boarding house in a different neighborhood within 8. The social worker's final entry reads, "Subject departed in good spirits, expressing confidence in her ability to manage her affairs." I have no idea what happened to Miss V after that. The file ends there. But I think about her fairly often because she represents something that the formal categories of boarding house history, the rule followers and the rule breakers, the respectable women and the fallen women, simply cannot contain. She was a young woman who had made choices that any reasonable human being could understand, lost almost everything because of those choices by the operation of a system that had no proportionality or mercy built into it, and come back. Not heroically, not dramatically, just steadily. With $4 and a determination that a social worker noticed and wrote down. What I want to say about all three of these women, Margaret Sanger, Eunice, Carter, Miss V, is something that I think gets lost when we look at the rule breakers of any era primarily through the lens of their rule breaking. The rules they broke or bent or declined to observe were not arbitrary. They were the specific rules of a specific system that had been designed to keep women in a particular relationship to the world dependent, available, manageable, and above all predictable. The women who departed from those rules were not simply nonconformists in the abstract sense. They were women who had decided by whatever particular route and at whatever particular cost that the life available to them within the system was not in some fundamental way worth the price of staying inside it. That decision was not free. It cost things that were real and sometimes irreplaceable: rooms, jobs, reputations, relationships, freedom. Some of the women who made it found their way to something better on the other side. Some did not. The historical record is honest about both outcomes, even when it wishes it could be more triumphant. And here is the thing I keep returning to, which is both obvious and somehow easy to miss. The women who stayed inside the rules, who followed the curfews and kept the parlour door open and managed their reputations with exhausting care, they were also making a choice. A constrained choice made under conditions that were not fair, but a choice. And their endurance inside those constraints, their daily insistence on surviving with dignity, was its own form of resistance, less visible, less narratable, but equally real. Every woman in the boarding house, rule breaker and rule follower alike, was doing the same fundamental thing, figuring out how to be a person in a world that kept offering her insufficient versions of that possibility. And then eventually, for most of them, she left. She packed whatever she'd managed to accumulate in the room, said whatever needed to be said to whoever needed to hear it, and walked out through that front door for the last time. What happened next is where this story ends, or rather where it opens out into something larger than any single door or any single decade. The women who left the boarding house, where they went, what they carried, and what the whole experience made of them, is the last chapter of this particular journey, and it is the one I've been saving for the end because it is the one that asks the question that the entire series has, in its own quiet way, been building toward. What does it mean to be formed by a place you were only ever supposed to be passing through? Let's find out. Most of the women who lived in boarding houses in the 1910s did not stay forever. That is, of course, the point. The boarding house was never supposed to be a destination. It was a threshold, a place you occupied while the rest of your life was still being arranged. The landlady knew it. The boarders knew it. Even the culture that surrounded it, the culture that surveilled and judged and set the curfews and wrote the etiquette columns, knew it. A woman in a boarding house was a woman in transit. Eventually she was supposed to arrive somewhere. What I want to spend our last section exploring together is that arrival. The moment the door of the boarding house closed behind a woman for the last time, what she was walking toward, what she was carrying that she could not have named when she first walked in, and what the boarding house, that imperfect, complicated, indispensable institution, actually gave to the women who passed through it in ways that shaped not just their individual lives, but the entire landscape of modern American womanhood. Let's start with the most common departure, the one that the culture had designed the whole system to produce: marriage. Between 1910 and 1920, the majority of women who left boarding houses left because they married. This is simply the statistical reality of the period, and it would be dishonest to minimize it. The boarding house was, among other things, a stage of life between dependence and the specific kind of dependence that marriage represented in this era, a stage in which a woman was paradoxically more self-determining than she would be in the household she was moving toward. Here is the thing that strikes me about this, and that I think deserves more attention than it typically gets. Many of the women who married in the 1910s and moved from boarding houses into domestic life brought with them something the women of their mother's generation largely did not have. They brought the specific hard-won competencies of self-sufficiency. They knew how to manage money, imperfect knowledge gained under brutal constraints but real. They knew how to navigate institutional systems employers, landlords, social services that their mothers had often encountered only through husbands. They knew from years of daily practice how to live in proximity with people who were not their family and still maintain functional, dignified relationships. Sociologist Robert Lind and his wife Helen Merrill. Lind conducted their famous study of Muncie, Indiana, published as Middletown in 1929, now considered one of the foundational texts of American sociology, and found something interesting when they looked at the generation of women who had come of age in the 1910s. Women in that generation showed on a range of measures significantly higher rates of what the Linds called autonomous household decision-making than the previous generation, meaning they participated more actively in decisions about finances, children's education, and community involvement. The Linds attributed this partly to education, partly to the general cultural shifts of the era. But the boarding house years, the years in which hundreds of thousands of these women had run their own economic lives, however tightly constrained, were part of that formation too. You do not spend 2 or 3 years figuring out how to make 50 cents cover a week's worth of contingencies and emerge from that experience without having internalized something durable. Now the second departure, the one that gets less airtime in the historical narrative but that I find genuinely extraordinary. Some women left the boarding house and did not get married, not as a temporary condition, but as a deliberate, sustained life choice. By 1920, according to the United States Census, approximately 11% of American women over the age of 35 had never married. That number had been rising steadily since 1880, and it would not be surpassed as a proportion until the early 21st century. Many of these women had spent significant parts of their 20s and 30s in boarding houses, or in the successor arrangements, small apartments shared with 1 or 2 other women that began to become more available as the decade progressed. Some of these women were teachers. The feminization of the American teaching profession had been underway since before the Civil War, and by the 1910s the majority of elementary school teachers in American cities were women. Many school districts had explicit rules prohibiting the employment of married women as teachers, the logic being that a married woman's primary obligation was to her household, and that she could not be fully committed to the classroom while also maintaining a home. This rule, which from a 21st century perspective looks like a straightforward instrument of discrimination, had a paradoxical effect. It created a professional class of unmarried women who were economically independent, educated and deeply embedded in their communities over decades-long careers. These women, the boarding house years behind them, their own apartments or shared houses ahead, were some of the most significant agents of cultural transmission in American history. The children they taught carried what they learned from them into every decade of the 20th century. The ideas that got distributed in those classrooms were shaped in part by teachers who had spent their formation years in the compressed, politically alive, socially complex world of the boarding house. That is not a minor legacy. The third departure is the rarest in the historical record, which means it is also the most undercounted, and I suspect the most significant in ways we are still not fully measuring. Some women left the boarding house and built something. Not metaphorically, literally. They started businesses, they founded organizations, they built professional practices in fields that had previously been entirely closed to them. The decade between 1910 and 1920, for all its constraints and inequities, was also the decade in which the foundations of women's professional presence in American life were laid in law, in medicine, in journalism, in business, in social work as a recognized profession with its own educational infrastructure and institutional standing. Many of the women who built these things had boarding house years in their past. The connection is not always traceable. The historical record of informal experience is fragmentary by nature, but it is consistent enough to be meaningful. Ida M., Tarbell, whose investigative journalism had broken open the Standard Oil monopoly in a 1904 series for McClure's magazine that remains one of the most consequential pieces of American journalism ever published, lived in boarding houses during her early years as a journalist in Washington and New York in the 1880s and 90s. She was writing in the generation before our 1910s focus, but she was the model that a generation of younger women journalists consciously followed. The boarding house was where she had learned, she later said in her autobiography, that professional ambition was not incompatible with a decent life, that the two things could coexist in the same woman in the same room at the same moment. By the 19-teens, women like Ida Tarbell had demonstrated that coexistence was possible. The women in the boarding houses of that decade grew up watching the proof. Dorothy Richardson, not the novelist, but a different Dorothy Richardson, a journalist and reformer who spent years in New York working-class boarding houses, gathering material for her 1905 book The Long Day, wrote something in that book that I have been turning over in my mind throughout this entire series. She wrote that the boarding house taught her above all else that poverty was not a character defect, that the women around her, women working brutal hours for inadequate wages, navigating a city that had not been built with their existence in mind, were not diminished by their circumstances. They were, she wrote simply, people who had not yet been given what they needed, and that gap between what they were and what the world was offering them was not their failure. It was the world's. I keep coming back to that formulation. Not their failure, the world's. Because here is what I think the boarding house story taken as a whole actually tells us, not about the 1910s specifically, but about something more durable. Every generation has its boarding house. Not literally, though. Literal boarding houses still exist in the form of shared housing and co-living arrangements that have made a significant return in the 21st century, for not entirely different reasons than the ones that drove women into boarding houses 100 years ago. But figuratively, every generation has the place where people who are between things, between the life they came from and the life they are trying to build, figure out how to survive the gap. What happens in that in-between place matters more than we usually acknowledge. The friendships formed there are some of the most formative. The skills acquired there, financial, social, emotional, are some of the most durable. The political consciousness that develops in those conversations over shared meals, in the accumulated grievance and solidarity and ordinary daily humanity of people thrown together by circumstance, that consciousness shapes the world in ways that are slow and invisible and absolutely real. The women of the 1910s boarding house built the scaffolding of modern American womanhood. Not the famous ones only, not the Clara Lemlichs and the Margaret Sangers and the Ida Tarbells, though all of them matter enormously, but also the Miss V's, also the Annas and the Leonoras and the unnamed Polish women at the South Halstead Street table, whose names never made it into the record. Also the Bridget Murphys, who built community infrastructure out of nothing but necessity and competence, and the willingness to open a door. They were 7.5 million women, working too long for too little, living in spaces smaller than they deserved, navigating a world that underestimated them with the consistency and thoroughness of an institution. And they endured, and they organized, and they voted finally in 1920. And they kept going. They were still there. Every single morning they were still there, and I think that counts for quite a lot. So here is where I want to leave you tonight. The next time you walk through a door into an unfamiliar room, a new job, a new city, a new chapter of your life that you did not entirely choose, think about the women in this story, not with nostalgia and not with pity, but with the specific recognition that you are doing something that human beings have always done, showing up in an imperfect place, making the best life possible inside the available space, and building quietly, incrementally, often invisibly, something that will outlast the room itself. That is what they did. in rooms that smelled of coal smoke and boiled cabbage at tables that seated 12 in beds that were sometimes not entirely their own. They built things that lasted. They built some of us in ways more direct than we might realize, and that is worth knowing, worth sitting with for a while in whatever room you are in right now before sleep comes. Thank you for spending this time with me. This series has been one of the most meaningful things I have made because the women in it deserve to be seen not as footnotes to more famous histories, but as the center of their own story. I hope they feel a little more visible tonight than they did this morning. If this journey moved something in you, if a moment in this series made you stop or think differently or feel something you did not expect to feel, I would genuinely love to hear about it. Leave a comment. Tell me which woman stayed with you. Tell me which room you would most and least want to have lived in. Tell me where you are listening from tonight and what the night sounds like wherever you are. And if you found value in what we built together across these 12 parts, subscribe, leave a like, share it with someone who you think would care about this kind of history. The channel only grows because you carry it forward. That is how any good thing gets further than the room it started in. The next story is already waiting. Different century, different women, different rooms, but the same essential question underneath all of it. What did it actually feel like to be alive then in that particular place, in that particular life? That question never gets old, and neither do the answers when you find the right ones. Until then, sleep well. You're in good company.